Welcome to the Evidence Lab. In this explainer, we're going to build a crystal clear conceptual map of spinal cord neuroanatomy. And why are we doing this? Well, so you can confidently localize clinical lesions without ever having to guess. We are keeping things incredibly clean, structured, and strictly evidence-based to sweep away all that textbook clutter. So let's just dive right into it. The absolute fundamental question we have to answer in neurology is localization. When a patient comes in with a very specific set of motor or sensory deficits, how do we pinpoint the exact anatomical location of the damage using just those symptoms? To pull this off, we basically have to act as cartographers. We have to map the precise routes of sensory and motor signals as they travel up and down the spinal cord. It's like tracing the wiring in a house to find the blown fuse. Now, to avoid complete cognitive overload, we'll break this down sequentially. We're going to start with the macro cross-section, trace the descending motor and ascending sensory pathways, apply those to dermatomes, distill our clinical takeaways, and finally look at the fascinating limitations of our current anatomical knowledge. Right, Section 1. Let's anchor ourselves spatially with the core architecture of the spinal cord. Notice how elegantly this maps the chaos. We have the soft blue motor pathways descending on the left side, and the pink sensory pathways ascending on the right, with the gray matter organized right in the center. Now, just keep in mind, this is a clean, schematic view to make learning easier. In reality, ascending and descending tracks coexist on both sides of the cord, but this mental model is absolutely crucial for keeping it all straight. Before we start tracing pathways, we've got to define our key landmarks. The dentate ligament is a major physical divider. It physically separates the dorsal roots from the ventral nerve roots. Actually, a fun bit of clinical trivia, the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, sits just dorsal to this ligament. Meanwhile, that central gray matter, it isn't just a uniform blob. It's divided into distinct zones called the lamina of Rext. For instance, lamina 2 acts as a substantia gelatinosa, which is a major processing station for pain, while lamina 3 and 4 form the nucleus proprius. With our map oriented, let's move right into Section 2. The motor pathways. Take a look at this data summarizing our key descending tracks. Notice the vital distinction here, whether they affect the same or opposite side of the body. Tracks like the vestibulospinal, which facilitates extensor muscle tone, and the rubrospinal, which helps with flexor muscle tone, affect the same side of the body. But our main player, the one that governs skilled movement, well, it behaves a bit differently. This is the big one, the journey of the lateral corticospinal tract, or the CST. This is your largest, most significant motor tract. It originates high up in the upper motor neurons, specifically those BET cells in the motor cortex. It sleeps down through the corona radiata and the internal capsule. Then comes the absolutely critical event. About 90% of these fibers literally cross over or decussate at the lower medulla to become the lateral CST. They finally travel down the cord to terminate on lower motor neurons right in rexid lamina 9. You have to remember that crossing point in the medulla. It is the absolute key to localizing motor weakness. Okay, moving to Section 3, let's map out the ascending sensory pathways. So here we have a massive clinical split in how sensory data actually reaches the brain. If you look at the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus at the top, these manage joint position and fine touch for the same side of the body. But if you drop down to the lateral spinothalamic tract, which handles pain and temperature, that pathway affects the opposite side of the body. Wait, why the difference? Let's trace them to find out. Let's track pain and temperature first. The first order neuron enters the cord and immediately synapses in rexid lamina 2, the substantia gelatinosa. Now pay super close attention to the second order neuron. It crosses the midline immediately, usually within just 1 to 3 segments, shooting right across the anterior white commissure to join the lateral spinal thalamic tract on the other side. Then it rides all the way up to the thalamus and finally to the sensory cortex. Because it crosses right away in the spinal cord, a lesion on one side of the cord will knock out pain and temp on the opposite side of the body below that level. But in stark contrast, look at fine touch, deep pressure, and proprioception. The first order neuron enters the cord and, actually, it doesn't synapse right away. Instead, it literally just turns and ascends up the same side of the cord in the posterior columns. It's carried by the gracilis tract for the lower body and the cuneus tract for the upper body. It travels all the way up to the lower medulla before it finally synapses and its second order neuron crosses over. Because its spinal cord journey is entirely uncrossed, a lesion in the cord causes a loss of fine touch on the same side of the body. Rounding out our sensory triad is light or crude touch. Now this pathway is a bit of a hybrid, but it follows a similar early crossing pattern to pain.
The fibers enter, synapse in rexid laminae V and VI, and then the second-order axons cross right over in the anterior white commissure to join the anterior spinal thalamic tract.
So we've mastered the internal wiring. Let's hit section 4 and transition to the outside of the body with dermatomes. This right here brilliantly illustrates a vital diagnostic distinction, differentiating a peripheral nerve injury from a spinal root injury. Dermatomes are areas supplied by a single nerve root, while peripheral nerves often get contributions from multiple roots. A classic textbook example is the splitting of sensation right down the middle of the ring finger. If you have a patient with numbness strictly on one half of their ring finger, that points directly to a peripheral nerve lesion, either the median or ulnar nerve. You simply will not see that precise splitting with a C8 spinal nerve root injury. Think of this complete dermatomal map as your clinical diagnostic dashboard. On the left side, you've got the pure segmental dermatomes, mapping back to specific spinal roots. On the right, you see the distinct, often overlapping territories of the named peripheral nerves. Memorizing the differences here is exactly how you confidently diagnose whether someone pinched a nerve root in their neck or just compressed a peripheral nerve in their wrist. All right, section 5. How do we actually use all of this? Let's distill it into our core clinical takeaways. So, what's the bottom line? Here is the absolute summary of spinal cord localization. Remember the crossing points. If a patient has muscle weakness, look at the motor pathways. Because the primary motor tract crosses high up in the medulla, a lesion in the spinal cord causes weakness on the same side. If they lose fine touch or proprioception, that tract also doesn't cross until the medulla, so the deficit is on the same side. But if they lose pain and temp sensation, remember that tract crosses instantly in the spinal cord. Therefore, the lesion is on the opposite side of the symptom. By combining that logic with your dermatome map, you've essentially mastered the cartography of the spinal cord. Finally, section 6. In the spirit of true evidence-based medicine, we always need to acknowledge the limitations of our current models. You know, even the most trusted, heavy-duty textbooks have to admit defeat sometimes. Looking closely at the source data, there are literal question marks next to structural tracts. The function of the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the spinal cord, currently listed as a question mark. The medullary reticulospinal tract's role is hypothesized as controlling automatic respirations, but it's not totally confirmed. And the spinotectal tract? Its function is listed as unknown, possibly nociceptive, but we just aren't sure yet. Which leaves us with a truly provocative thought to end on. If we're still placing question marks next to physical, structural tracts in the human spinal cord today, what other hidden compensatory pathways or undiscovered sensory loops are just waiting to be mapped by the next generation of neurologists? The human nervous system is incredibly resilient, and it seems there are still some pretty profound secrets hidden right there in the tissue, just waiting for the right evidence to bring them to light.